Rust has a sound if you listen closely enough. It is the slow, microscopic fracture of iron giving way to air and time. Most people look at rust and see decay. They see a failure of maintenance, a lack of care, a drop in property values. They see junk. 10-year-old Clara Miller did not see junk. She saw a map. Clara lived on the last remaining acre of what used to be the Miller family orchard. For 4 generations, her family had worked the heavy, clay-rich soil of the valley. But time, taxes, and the relentless creep of the suburbs had eaten away at the acreage until all that was left was the original 1902 farmhouse, a leaning detached garage, and the front yard. And sitting dead center in that front yard, sinking roughly half an inch into the topsoil, every decade was the machine. It was a 1927 Waterloo Boy prototype, though you couldn't read the manufacturer's plate anymore unless you knew exactly where to rub the oxidation away. It was a massive, hulking skeleton of cast iron, steel cleats, and exposed gears. The paint had surrendered to the sun 50 years before Clara was even born, leaving behind a mottled, beautiful patina of burnt orange, deep oxblood, and weathered brown. Clara knew every inch of that tractor. She knew that the deep groove on the primary flywheel was from where the drive belt had snapped during the Great Freeze of '38, nearly taking her great-grandfather's arm off. She knew that the peculiar, non-standard exhaust manifold was a custom modification forged by a local blacksmith because the factory parts couldn't handle the valley's steep inclines. She knew all of this because she kept her great-grandfather's service ledger in a fireproof box under her bed. It was a heavy, leather-bound book, the pages brittle and smelling of old motor oil and dried tobacco. She read it like other kids read fantasy novels. She wasn't a loud child. She was observant. She liked things that lasted, but the world around Clara's 1-acre island did not care about things that lasted. It cared about things that looked uniform. Over the last 2 years, the surrounding land had been aggressively leveled, paved, and transformed into the estates at Oak Ridge. It was a sprawling, high-end subdivision characterized by beige stucco, perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass, and rules. Lots of rules. Because the Miller house sat at the geographical center of the new development, right at the entrance of the main cul-de-sac. The developers had forcefully annexed the Miller property into the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Clara's father, a quiet high school history teacher who was too exhausted by his wife's recent passing to fight a team of corporate lawyers, had signed the paperwork just to make them go away. That was his first mistake. If you've ever lived somewhere where the length of your grass is dictated by a committee of people with too much free time, you know exactly where this is going. Stay with me. And if you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with an HOA from hell. Let's get back to Oak Ridge. The letters started arriving in early April. They were printed on thick, cream-colored paper with the Oak Ridge Estate's crest embossed at the top. The first one was a friendly reminder regarding Section 4, Article 12 of the Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. It stated that all yard ornaments, statues, and non-operational vehicles must be removed from the public line of sight. Clara's father put it in the recycling bin. The tractor wasn't an ornament. It was heavy iron, and it had been sitting in that exact spot since Truman was in office. 2 weeks later, the second letter arrived. This one was sent via certified mail. It was a notice of violation. It included a black and white photograph of the tractor taken from the sidewalk with a red circle drawn around it. The fine was $50. Clara watched from the porch as the HOA president himself came to inspect the property the following Tuesday. His name was Richard Sterling. He drove a spotless silver German sedan and wore a navy blue quarter zip sweater, even though it was 80 degrees outside. He carried a tablet in a leather case. Richard didn't walk on the grass. He stayed strictly on the concrete path, holding his tablet up to take photos of the rusted iron. Clara walked down the wooden steps, her great-grandfather's ledger clutched to her chest. "It's a Waterloo, boy," Clara said quietly, stopping at the edge of the grass. Richard jumped slightly, not having noticed her. He looked down his nose, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. He gave her a tight, practiced smile, the kind of smile adults use when they want a child to go away. "Hello there," Richard said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. "Is your father home? We need to have a chat about this debris." "It's not debris," Clara replied, her voice perfectly even. "It cleared the timber for this whole valley. My great-grandpa bought it in 1927. It's a prototype. There were only 4 ever made with the offset axle." Richard chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. He tapped his screen with a stylus. "That's a nice story, sweetheart. But Oak Ridge is a premier community. We have property values to maintain. Rust is a blight, and blight is a violation. Tell your dad the fine doubles every 14 days until he pays someone to haul it to the scrapyard." He turned his back on her, got into his silver car, and drove perfectly at the speed limit down the spotless street. Clara looked down at the old ledger. She ran her thumb over a faded ink entry from October 1932. She didn't cry, she didn't get angry. She just went back inside. She knew something Richard Sterling didn't. She knew how deep the roots of that heavy iron really went. By July, the fines had cascaded. The HOA had applied compounding interest, daily penalties, and aesthetic disruption fees. The total balance levied against the Miller household sat at an astonishing $10,450. Clara's father was losing sleep. The stress was hollowing out his face. He sat at the kitchen table late at night, rubbing his eyes, looking at the threatening letters. The HOA was threatening to place a lien on the house. They were threatening foreclosure. "I'll just call a scrapper Clara," her dad said one evening, his voice cracking. "I can't fight them. I don't have the money for a lawyer. We just have to let it go." Clara placed her hand on his wrist. "Dad, don't call anyone. Let's go to the board meeting on Thursday." "Clara, they won't listen. Just let me talk to them," she said. The Oak Ridge HOA board met in the clubhouse, a sterile, over-air conditioned room that smelled heavily of vanilla plug in air fresheners and floor wax. At the front of the room sat a long folding table. Behind it sat Richard Sterling and 3 other board members, all looking remarkably similar in their neutral, toned, wrinkle-free clothing. Clara and her father sat in the folding chairs in the audience row. When the agenda reached open violations, Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone. Property 402, Miller Residence. Refusal to cure an aesthetic violation. Unregistered, rusting farm equipment in the front yard. Total outstanding fines $10,450. Mr. Miller, you have 3 minutes to state your case before we move to initiate lien proceedings. Clara's father stood up, but Clara stood up faster. She walked to the small podium in the center of the room. She carried the heavy, leather-bound ledger. The board members exchanged amused, patronizing glances. "Oh, Mr. Miller, please," Richard sighed. "We don't have time for show and tell. "My name is Clara Miller," she said into the microphone. Her voice was small but steady. "And you can't tow the tractor, and you can't fine us." Richard leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "And why is that, Clara?" He spoke to her as if she were a toddler who had just claimed the moon was made of cheese. Clara opened the ledger. "Because you are enforcing Section 4, Article 12 of your bylaws. That section only applies to personal property. The tractor isn't personal property anymore. It's a hunk of rusted garbage sitting on our visual corridor." A woman next to Richard snapped. Clara didn't flinch. In 1984, the state of the tractor's preservation, along with its historical significance to the founding of this county, was evaluated. "My grandfather submitted the paperwork." Clara reached into the back of the ledger and pulled out a yellowed piece of thick parchment paper, stamped with a heavy gold foil seal. "If you move it," Clara said, her eyes locking onto Richard's, "you will be violating the State Historical Preservation Act. That machine is registered as a Class 1 permanent historical monument. The ground beneath it is a protected archaeological microsite." She placed a copy of the deed restriction on the podium. "I'm giving you a warning," Clara said quietly. "If you touch it, the fines won't come from an HOA. They will come from the federal government." Richard stared at her. For a moment, the room was dead silent. Then Richard smiled. It was a cold, arrogant smile. The smile of a man who believed a piece of paper on his clipboard was more powerful than anything else in the world. "That's very cute, Clara," Richard said softly, "but the HOA supersedes outdated local zoning. We are a private entity. The fine stands. And since your father refuses to cure the violation, the HOA will cure it for him. We have hired a heavy recovery tow company. They will be at your property on Monday morning at 8:00 a.m. to remove the debris. Any interference will result in police action." He banged a small wooden gavel. "Next item." Clara didn't argue. She carefully picked up her paper, closed her great-grandfather's ledger, and walked back to her father. She had done exactly what the old notebooks taught her to do. She had given them fair warning. What Richard Sterling didn't realize was that he hadn't just ignored a little girl. He had just declared war on a century of buried iron, state law, and the Federal Department of the Interior. And Monday morning was going to be a disaster. Monday morning arrived with the kind of heavy, humid stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, casting a flat, shadowless light over the pristine lawns of the estates at Oak Ridge. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the silence of the cul-de-sac was shattered by the deep, throaty roar of a commercial diesel engine, a massive, heavy-duty recovery wrecker, the kind usually reserved for hauling overturned semi-trucks out of ravines, turned onto the street. Its yellow warning light strobed against the beige stucco houses. Behind the wrecker drove Richard Sterling in his spotless silver sedan, followed by two other members of the HOA board. They parked along the curb, forming a small, self-important motorcade. Clara and her father were already sitting on the front porch. Her father held a mug of black coffee, his knuckles white. Clara sat beside him, the heavy leather ledger resting on her knees. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone waiting for a train she knew was running exactly on schedule. Richard stepped out of his car, holding his ever-present tablet. He wore a crisp white polo shirt and a smug, satisfied expression. He didn't look at Clara or her father. He gestured to the tow truck operator, a burly man named Mike who was already unspooling a thick steel winch cable from the back of the rig. "I want it gone, Mike." Richard called out, his voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood. "Take it to the scrap yard on Route 9. The HOA is covering the towing fee, and will be adding it to the miller's outstanding balance." Mike, the operator, walked up to the 1927 Waterloo boy. He kicked one of the massive, steel-cleated rear wheels. It didn't make a hollow sound. It made a deep, resonant thud, like kicking a mountain. "This thing is heavy," Mike grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead. It sunk into the clay. "I'm going to have to drag it a few feet to break the suction before I can lift the front axle." "Just do what you have to do," Richard said, checking his watch. "We have a landscaping crew coming at noon to sod this patch of dirt." Mike dragged the heavy J hooks toward the front of the tractor, looping the thick chains around the cast iron front axle. He signaled to his partner in the cab to take up the slack. The diesel engine revved. The steel cable snapped taut, humming like a plucked guitar string. The wrecker pulled. The Waterloo boy did not move. The wrecker's engine roared louder, thick black smoke belching from its exhaust stacks. The rear tires of the tow truck began to slip, squealing against the asphalt, leaving thick black streaks on the pristine Oak Ridge street. "Give it more juice," Richard yelled over the noise, his calm facade slipping slightly. Mike waved his arms at the driver. The winch strained. The heavy steel cable groaned, the individual strands tightening to their absolute limit. The front wheels of the multi-ton truck actually lifted an inch off the pavement. The 70-year-old rusted iron of the tractor held its ground. The earth had claimed it, and it was not letting go. Before the tow truck could snap its own cable, a new sound cut through the roar of the diesel. It was the sharp, piercing wail of a police siren. 3 vehicles turned sharply onto the cold D-sack. But they weren't local police cruisers. The first 2 were dark green SUVs with the seal of the State Department of Natural Resources and Historic Preservation emblazoned on the doors. The third was a black, unmarked federal vehicle. They didn't park neatly on the curb. They angled their vehicles directly in front of the tow truck, blocking it in. The doors opened, and 5 people stepped out. 4 of them wore dark uniforms, heavy-duty belts, and mirrored sunglasses. The 5th person was a tall, severe-looking woman in a tailored gray suit. She carried a thick red legal folder. Richard Sterling lowered his tablet, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me," he shouted, walking toward the woman. "You're blocking an active recovery zone. This is a private community. We have an HOA action in progress." The woman in the gray suit didn't look at Richard. She looked at the taut steel cable wrapped around the tractor's axle. "Drop the tension on that winch," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying absolute authority. "Drop it right now, or I will have my officers place you in handcuffs." Mike, the tow operator, didn't hesitate. He frantically signaled his driver. The winch whined, and the steel cable slacked, falling into the grass. Richard's face flushed dark red. "Who do you think you are?" "I am the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. We have a legal lien on this property for uncorrected aesthetic violations. That machinery is unauthorized debris." The woman finally turned her gaze to Richard. It was like watching a hawk look at a field mouse. "My name is Director Vance," she said coldly. "I am the State Historic Preservation Officer. And you, Mr. Sterling, are currently standing on a protected Class 1 archaeological micro site, actively attempting to destroy a registered state monument." Richard blinked. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Director Vance opened her red folder. On Thursday of last week, my office received a digitized packet of documents from a Miss Clara Miller. These documents included the original 1984 state registry confirmation, federal land use exemptions, and a signed declaration from the Department of the Interior. She pulled out a photograph. It was the same photo Richard had taken of the tractor, the one with the red circle drawn around it, which he had mailed to Clara with the fine. Miss Miller also provided written proof that a private corporation, your HOA, was threatening the unauthorized removal and destruction of this monument. Vance continued, her voice slicing through the humid morning air. I see you brought a tow truck. How remarkably stupid of you. It's a pile of rust, Richard sputtered, his polished demeanor completely shattering. It's an eyesore. It violates Section 4 of our bylaws. Our bylaws supersede local zoning. Director Vance took a slow, measured step toward Richard. The state troopers behind her shifted their hands to rest near their utility belts. Your bylaws, Vance said quietly, do not supersede the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. They do not supersede the Federal Antiquities Act. That pile of rust is one of only 4 offset Axel Waterloo boy prototypes left on the face of the earth. It is a vital artifact of the agricultural industrialization of this valley. It is legally protected with the same ferocity as a 19th century battlefield die. Richard looked at the tractor, then back to the director, his tablet shaking slightly in his hand. What? We fined them $10,000. They have to pay the fine. No, Mr. Sterling? Vance corrected. They don't. But you do. Vance pulled a thick stack of citations from her folder and thrust them against Richard's chest. He reflexively grabbed them. By entering this protected micro site with heavy machinery, you have committed an act of historical desecration. By attaching a winch to the artifact, you have attempted the destruction of a registered monument. Vance pointed a sharp finger at the deep ruts the tow truck's tires had left in the grass near the tractor. Furthermore, the soil beneath that tractor has not been disturbed since 1952. It is considered an untouched stratigraphy site. You just drove a commercial wrecker over it. By federal law, any disturbance of a registered site requires a comprehensive archaeological survey to assess the damage. Richard was pale now, his eyes darting frantically across the citations. What does that mean? It means... Vance smiled, and it was a terrible, bureaucratic smile, that your homeowners association is now legally required to hire a federally approved archaeological team to excavate, sift, and analyze the tire tracks you just made. The average cost for an emergency survey of this nature is roughly $85,000, payable immediately. One of the other board members standing near Richard's car made a faint choking sound. Add to that, Vance continued, not missing a beat, the fines for attempted destruction of the monument. That is $50,000 per infraction. I count 3 infractions: the order to tow, the trespassing on the microsite, and the physical attachment of the winch. Richard dropped his tablet. It hit the concrete sidewalk with a sharp crack, the screen splintering. $235,000, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. The HOA reserve fund doesn't have that kind of money. We'll be bankrupt. We'll have to levy a special assessment on the entire neighborhood. I suggest you call a board meeting, then, Vance said smoothly, because if those fines are not paid to the state treasury within 30 days, the state will place a lien on the Oak Ridge Clubhouse, the community pool, and every inch of common area you own. We will seize it. Vance turned away from the devastated OA president and walked toward the porch where Clara and her father were still sitting. The director's severe expression softened as she looked at Clara. She looked down at the old, leather-bound ledger resting on the little girl's lap. "You kept the record safe," Vance said softly. Clara nodded. "My great-grandfather said the land remembers, but only if you write it down." "He was right," Vance said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass medallion. It bore the seal of the State Historical Registry. She handed it to Clara. "This belongs on the machine. You hold on to it until the perimeter is built." Clara's father stood up, still looking utterly bewildered by the sudden shift in the universe. Perimeter? What perimeter? Vance turned back to look at the tractor. Mike, the tow operator, had already hastily unhooked his chains and was speeding out of the coal. Sack, desperate to escape federal involvement. Part of the remediation order, Vance explained to Clara's father, requires the offending party to secure the monument against future disturbances. The Oak Ridge HOA is now legally mandated to construct a wrought, iron protective perimeter fence around the tractor, built to historical preservation standards. They are also required to install a cast bronze informational plaque detailing the history of the Waterloo boy. Vance glanced over her shoulder at Richard, who was currently sitting on the curb with his head in his hands, surrounded by panicking board members. "And the HOA will be paying for all of it," Vance added, "down to the last bolt." The collapse of the Oak Ridge HOA was swift and brutal. When the rest of the neighborhood found out that Richard Sterling's crusade against a rusty tractor had resulted in a massive special assessment fee for every single household, a recall election was held immediately. Richard was ousted in a unanimous vote. He put his pristine stucco house on the market 3 weeks later and moved away in disgrace. The new HOA board was terrified. They immediately voided the $10,450 fine against the Miller family, striking it from the record entirely. They sent Clara's father a deeply apologetic, handwritten letter begging for his patience as they complied with the state's demands. By September, the contractors arrived. They didn't come to destroy, they came to build. They installed a beautiful, heavy-wrought iron fence around the 1-acre boundary of the Miller property, separating it forever from the beige uniformity of the subdivision. And right in front of the tractor, they poured a small concrete pedestal and mounted a heavy bronze plaque. The plaque detailed the history of the machine, the date it was purchased, and the name of Clara's great-grandfather. Clara sat on the porch in the cool autumn air, the leather ledger open on her lap. She uncapped a black pen and carefully wrote a new entry. She documented the dates the fence went up. She documented the arrival of the plaque. She looked out at the heavy iron machine. The autumn sun caught the deep oxblood and burnt orange of the patina, making the rust glow like a dying ember. Most people look at rust and see decay. They see a failure, they see junk. But Clara knew the truth. Rules change, boards get replaced, paint fades, and stucco cracks and suburban developments eventually fall out of fashion. But iron waits. It roots itself in the soil, and it holds its ground. And if you know how to read the records it leaves behind, you realize that the quietest things in the yard are usually the ones with the most power. You just have to be smart enough to leave them alone. If you've ever seen arrogance get crushed by the quiet weight of history, you know exactly why Clara won. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of the underworld dark finance, and systems getting dismantled from the inside out. Until next time, keep your records safe and never underestimate the heavy machinery.